New details now on a decision by the Trump administration that could impact how safe our water is. The administration withdrawing a proposal that would have limited the amount of forever chemicals, PFAS, that can go into water sources around our area. WECT's Connor Smith has the latest on how this could impact us. Connor, this has been an issue we've been talking about for years. So what happens now?
Well, Fran, I talked to a couple experts on this issue today, and they tell me the pressure is really now on state and local authorities to make changes and, most importantly, keep us safe.
For years, we've known this water is full of forever chemicals, PFAS. The chemicals' hazardous impacts numerous. But the Trump administration now scrapping plans to limit how much of those chemicals can end up here in the first place.
Disappointed but not surprised.
Emily Donovan is part of the Clean Cape Fear Group, which is working to highlight the impacts of PFAS on our region. The chemicals showing up in our drinking water and firefighter gear for years and linked to all sorts of serious health issues, including different types of cancer. She says the Trump administration needs to take this issue seriously.
We need to treat this situation exactly what it is. It's a public health crisis. We know that. The science is very clear on exposures to these chemicals.
The withdrawn proposal would have limited how much PFAS can be discharged into wastewater. The EPA announced it last year and brought the proposal to the White House. Nothing was ever done with it. NC State professor Sue Fenton has been researching this issue for decades. She says the proposal would have been a step in the right direction.
These rules are sort of a win-win. There are many things that are in water that are harmful to people's health, and PFAS is only one of them.
Donovan says the cost now comes back to you and your tax dollars. Local governments now shouldering the cost of cleaning up the water, and state leaders left without guidance from Washington on what to do.
I think the state maybe needs to start acting a little more aggressively and move quicker on this topic.
But for now, the push for regulating what goes in this water still getting stuck in the sand.
Now, we also reached out to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality to see what they're doing in response. They sent us this statement. It reads, quote, DEQ is reviewing and evaluating the actions being taken by the President's administration to address the impacts on North Carolinians' public health and the environment. Reducing PFAS at the discharge source is the most cost-effective way to protect public health and the environment. DEQ is continuing to work with policymakers, affected communities, water utilities, and businesses to reduce or eliminate PFAS contamination in drinking water supplies. Now, Fran, Donovan says most people are in agreement. This issue needs to be fixed. The issue is really just how exactly we go about doing that.
But Connor, we understand there's still a chance this proposal could move forward.
Yeah, that's right, Fran. This decision was part of a broader freeze against any new federal rule that had been proposed, but the administration will be reviewing it and could approve it down the road.
All right, we'll see what happens. Thanks so much, Connor.